So what I want to talk about this evening is the energy price crisis, which I think is a topical thing. You may think of the energy price crisis as being perhaps hopefully a short-term phenomenon. I'm not so sure. I'm going to try to explain in the next few minutes why not. And that prescriptions for getting us out of this crisis are as likely to make things worse as better. So I'm going to begin by saying a few words about the long-term decline in the energy return on energy invested in fossil fuel supply. So I think the term itself conjures up, I hope conjures up the meaning of the thing. In order to get oil out of the ground, we have to spend energy to drill and pump and so on. And one of the things that appears to be happening is that the energy return on energy invested for fossil fuels in general tends to decline. So, although the literature around this phenomenon is complex and not entirely definitive, it does appear to be real, and there are engineering correlates of the phenomenon which are very obvious. So, for example, it appears now to take something like 10 times as much drilling to get down to oil-bearing strata underground as it did in the 20th century, which I recall fondly. Some of you may not be familiar with the 20th century, at least not directly. Some of you may have been weaned in the 20th century, it's entirely possible.
Oh yeah. But
perhaps not much more than that. But the 20th century was a real phenomenon. I was there for a while. I sometimes describe myself as a visitor from the second millennium. But let's get back to the subject in hand. What's happening is that the statistical distribution of resource size, geology, accessibility of fossil fuel resources that obviously impacts the timing of their discovery and the cost of extracting them. And it also affects the rate at which the production from these fields, various deposits decline as time goes on. Something you may not realise is that peak coal in the United Kingdom occurred in something like 1910. So for us, in this windswept island off the northwest coast of Europe, the Eurasian landmass, fossil fuels have been in decline now for more than a century. And we have a fairly modest endowment of oil and of gas, which has been discovered more recently, but those are now also in sharp decline. Globally, peak conventional oil seems to have happened perhaps 5 years ago. These things are always difficult to time directly. And the difference between growing demand and the decline in peak conventional oil is being made up with things like fracking, which is more expensive to do, requires more capital to undertake it. The production of fracked fields declines more quickly. One of the implications of the decline in energy return on energy invested is that more capital has to be invested to secure each new unit of production. A declining interest rate is one possible way to fund this, and Rifon and I have begun to speculate as to whether the decline that we have seen in interest rates globally over the last 20 years or so has perhaps something very complex to do with the need to produce oil from ever more difficult resources. Okay, this is a speculation. Any such relationship is going to be complex. It can be mediated by political systems, regulatory systems, by the engineering of getting oil and gas out of the ground. But I think it's an interesting speculation. It's also been mediated, the production from ever more difficult resources has also been mediated by the injection of unprecedentedly large amounts of money into national economies. And I think this is a real phenomenon which historically has led to disaster. And I would just point to the collapse of two civilizations, two empires. The first was the Roman Empire, with which the debasement of the money supply was clearly associated, but the extent to which it's causal is something that historians still debate. I would draw your attention to the discussion in Tainter's book on the collapse of complex societies, which I find an absolutely riveting, if a slightly depressing read, given where we are in the first quarter of the 21st century. I think I would urge you to take a look at that book. It's absolutely fascinating. And also, of course, Ferguson's book on the financial collapse in the Weimar Republic in Germany following the First World War. At some point we'll circulate the notes of this talk, and you can read the references yourself. But it's possible, it's always possible, perhaps it's possible, that through their application at global scale, this is the first time that we've attempted these experiments, these financial economic experiments at global scale, and with the introduction of unprecedented means of social control, and in the absence of other shocks, and of course we appear already to be well into the next shock, collapse might be delayed. My talks at these events are normally quite upbeat. I decided, I don't think particularly upbeat at the moment. In the long run, it appears, I have, my colleague Paul Drummond and I have a paper, recently published a paper on this, that the world might be able to decouple itself from fossil fuels by switching to renewables. But this cannot happen quickly. At the moment, new renewables, by which I mean solar, PV and wind, account for about 1% of global primary energy production. Which essentially means that fossil fuels and things like hydro and nuclear currently account for about 99% crudely of the embodied energy content of new renewables. So we are building the lifeboat that we hope to step into in the second half of this century with the tail end of fossil fuel production and consumption. And there is no way around that. One of the first films that I was taken to see was a little film called Around the World in 80 Days. And one of the images I retained from watching this at the age of 5 or 6 was the actors sawing up the deck of a wooden paddle steamer which was crossing, yes, you're nodding, you've seen it, yes. Which was crossing one of the Great Lakes in North America. In order to feed the wood into the boiler because they had run out of coal to feed the boiler. And we are, I suspect, at that kind of stage in the transition between fossil fuels and renewables. I am, in the long run, broadly optimistic about renewable energy, but it's not obvious that we'll be able to get there painlessly. Will be funded overwhelmingly by the existing fossil fuel economy. In addition, the declining energy return on energy invested of oil and gas makes it likely that it will require more, not less, investment to sustain our existing fossil fuel economy for long enough to make the jump to renewables, globally and regionally and nationally. From this perspective, attempts in recent years to reduce or to cut off finance to the oil and gas industries appear to me, to us, to be premature. To the extent that these attempts are successful, they risk leading to economic stagnation and or contraction, and as a result damaging rather than stimulating the emerging global renewable sector. And one of the things that we've seen recently is that German industry, for example, production facilities for making wind turbine blades are at risk of closing because they can't get the energy that they need. I now want to move on to geopolitical factors, because although this is not my speciality, it affects energy, and I am, goodness help us, a specialist of a sort in energy, and so I feel obliged to say something about the geopolitical situation. So the recent trend to higher oil and gas prices began in 2021, actually preceding the war in Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine is not the sole cause, or indeed the predominant cause, of high energy prices. And these appear to have been driven by a rebound in global and national economies as they emerged from COVID restrictions, coupled with the increased difficulty, the increased tightness, as economists would put it, of the oil market and the gas market. With respect to oil prices, the onset of the war appears as a short transient in February and March of this year, superimposed on a more or less linear, up to that point, underlying trend to increased oil and gas prices. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. One of the implications of that is that if we were simply to be able to stop the war, which doesn't appear likely in the near term, things probably wouldn't return to what we might think of as normal, which was kind of energy price environment that we were familiar with up until about 2019 or thereabouts. The situation with respect to natural gas is complex, and the reason for this is that the global natural gas market displays much stronger regionality than the global crude oil market, and recent price rises in Europe have been much higher, for example, than in North America in natural gas. Most of the impacts of the war on European markets actually appear, as far as we can see, to result directly from actions coordinated by Western powers to decouple Western Europe from Russian oil and gas. So this is worth thinking through a little bit. These actions include the seizure of Russian funds, and I'm not expressing an opinion here on the rights and wrongs of the war in Ukraine. I'm deliberately not doing that. I'm simply describing the impact of the responses of the Western powers, and our government here in the United Kingdom at the moment is in turmoil. We may not have a government by morning. The banning of Russian banks from the SWIFT interbank payment system, and the refusal by Western Europe to pay Russia in rubles, indeed to pay Russia in anything at all for its oil and gas, which is an interesting commercial position to take. The result has paradoxically but predictably been to increase Russian financial receipts from overseas sales of natural gas and oil, and more than 5 months after the invasion, Russia's position has been strengthened, the economic position has been strengthened, while Western economies are in turmoil. It's interesting to think about that as a strategy for winning a war. The Western strategy amounts to a reversal of OPEC's strategy in the wake of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Some of you, one of you, remembers.
Sorry, don't point that out. Another thing.
Remembers the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when the OPEC consortium effectively cut off oil supplies to the Western powers that were at that time assisting Israel in the war, 1973. Then an oil embargo was implemented by oil exporting countries against oil importers, and generally we coped. the Dutch Queen took to cycling around Holland. I don't know whether she's still with us. I suspect she may have passed.
No, I think it's her son.
I think it's her son now, yes, that's right. But she was there for a very long time. The Queen, our Queen didn't take to cycling around Britain,
No.
which I think says very much about the relationship between the two monarchies to the peoples that they rule. In 2022, however, the European Union and NATO, major importers of energy, food and raw materials from the Soviet Union, have voluntarily embargoed their major supplier of all of these commodities. To put it bluntly, the West has OPEC'd itself. As others have pointed out, it's hard to imagine a more obviously self-defeating strategy. Regardless of what you think about the rights and wrongs of the war itself, if you want to succeed, it's not obvious that this is the way to do it. One of the consequences of the rising gas prices that has occurred through 2021 has been a surge in the price of nitrogen fertiliser. Now, probably not many of you regularly use large amounts of nitrogen fertiliser, at least not knowingly. This has resulted in reductions and delays in the application of nitrogen fertiliser to fields in the Northern Hemisphere, which, coupled with the obvious seasonality of food production, I mean, food grows in the warm half of the year and doesn't grow in the cold half of the year, bluntly, to put it simply, means that even if an immediate diplomatic solution to the Ukraine war were to be found, a reduction in global food production this year is now unavoidable. One of the ways of making nitrogen fertiliser is to react, I guess, nitrogen with methane. The hydrogen atoms jump from the carbon to the nitrogen to give you ammonia, and everything else appears as carbon dioxide and maybe a bit of water. I'm making this up as I go.
You are.
Is there a chemist?
There is.
Is there a chemist in the room?
It's a very old
Dr. Vincent
Understands
here.
how to do
Yeah,
this.
it's the Haber process. It's about 100 years
The Haber process,
Yes,
okay.
and it's nitrogen with a very clever catalyst, and it's 3% efficient.
And it's 3% efficient, okay.
Wow,
Right, there we go.
really
Apart from that, I know nothing.
Apart from that, he knows nothing.
Stop
So
repeating what I said.
not only does he remember the Yom Kippur War, but he also remembers chemistry, which is an extraordinary thing.
It is amazing. Physics, on the other hand.
I hope you're coping with this.
It's a bit of a struggle, to be honest. To keep up.
You're going to get to the cheerful bit in a moment.
Yeah,
I suppose.
Any conclusions on this?
This reduction in production has been further exacerbated by the direct disruption of agriculture in Ukraine and by the disruption of the export of grain produced by Ukraine in 2021. The Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, recently issued an unprecedented warning of food shortages in the United Kingdom. And he was talking, he couldn't remember how many horsemen of the apocalypse there were, but he couldn't remember.
Well, that's because of your education, isn't it?
He obviously wasn't brought up properly,
No.
but he was talking in apocalyptic terms. The impact of this on the UK population may be significantly more severe than the direct impact, I suspect, of simply high gas prices. One of the most recent developments is the attempt by the Dutch government recently, I think in the last few weeks, to enforce a large reduction in the use of nitrogen fertilisers in Holland, which is one of the most productive agricultural countries in the world. What, therefore, we face, I suspect, is not short-term fuel poverty, but long-term general impoverishment in the West. This will shape all sorts of things. The politics of the UK-Ukraine war are like the politics of war going back at least as far as the Vietnam War, inevitably and enduringly controversial. Going back further, I had the pleasure of reading Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914, I think around Easter time. This documents at considerable length the blundering, second-guessing and miscommunication between states that led, over the space of just a few deaths, to the a few years to the deaths of as many as 40 million people in Europe, the collapse of 3 empires, and ultimately to World War II. We have deliberately avoided, Leifholm and I, commenting on the causes of this new war. What we are doing is simply dealing with the consequences of the war and the responses of the various states, in particular Western states, to its effort. The war looks like it will affect the UK population through multiple mechanisms, including things like food, access to paid employment via impacts on cost of transport. I happened at random to have a conversation with a man at a petrol pump, I think last week or just the week before, in which he was saying to the passenger in the car, that at some point people will simply rebel, which I thought was a very interesting conversation, because I have never heard anything like that in this country before. That was a turning point for me. I think I'm not here commenting on the idea of whether it's a good idea to rebel, but saying that these are conversations that are now being had. And of course the disruption of supply chains, which will disrupt everything, including attempts to build out renewable energy systems to replace the fossil fuel systems which are now beginning to disintegrate. Even if the war were brought to an end tomorrow, some of its effects, such as the reorganisation of global trade in oil and gas to the disadvantage of the West, are likely to be permanent. I suspect what we will see is de-dollarisation. This seems to be now common currency in policy-making circles. And I suspect that that will be permanent. I don't think that China and Russia will continue to, or parts of Africa or parts of South America will continue to pay for their oil and gas in dollars. Now, there are no experts on this sort of thing. As energy experts, my suggestion is that we are in as good a position as anybody else to comment on this, particularly in the context of its impacts on energy. That, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and students, brings me to the end of my little talk this evening. I said it wouldn't be quite as upbeat as my previous talks, but I think it's important to think about where this might leave us in coming years. I think there will be continued need for energy experts. There will almost certainly be a need for a significant effort to help, in particular, the poorer sections of our societies in general, to make it through the next few years. That turns out to be a non-trivial exercise. You can't simply tell people what to do, sorting out exactly how you help people. It seems that co-production of knowledge, action research techniques and so on are likely to be at least as effective as boffins sitting in their laboratories working out what ought to be done and then telling people. We may not, I suspect, get to net zero quite as quickly as we might have expected. The fact that we buy most of our PV, I think all of our PV and most of our wind turbines effectively from China, how we negotiate that relationship will be different in the future and probably not to our advantage.